The forest goes quiet before you hear anything. One moment there is birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant clatter of a woodpecker working a dead cedar. Then, nothing. A silence so complete it has a texture to it. Thick, pressing, wrong. You are a farmer's son, 12 years old, carrying firewood down from the hills above Kyoto in the early 9th century. The path is narrow. The trees on either side are old-growth sugi, trunks wider than a man's arm span, their canopies closing out most of the afternoon light. You have walked this path 100 times. You know every root, every stone, every turn, but your legs have stopped moving because 30 feet ahead of you, in the middle of the path, a Japanese wolf is watching you, not prowling, not fleeing, watching, head low, shoulders high, with the particular stillness of something that is not yet decided. It is smaller than you expected, the size of a large dog, tawny gray, ribs faintly visible under a winter coat. But the eyes are wrong for a dog. There is no expectation of kindness in them. You remember what your father told you. Do not run, do not crouch, be bigger than you feel. You slowly set down the bundle of wood. You straighten, you spread your arms. The wolf watches you for another 3 seconds. Then it turns, without hurry, and steps off the path into the undergrowth. By the time you hear your own heartbeat again, it is already gone. You do not know it yet, but that wolf is the least dangerous thing in those hills. How did ordinary people in ancient Japan live, work, and sleep within reach of animals that could kill them and mostly survive? Here is what most people assume when they think about predators in ancient Japan. They picture samurai, trained warriors who ventured into the mountains and fought off bears with katana in hand, while farmers huddled safely behind village walls. They assumed the dangerous animals were exotic, enormous, legendary, the kind of creatures you only encountered if you went looking for trouble. They are wrong on almost every count. Samurai did not hunt predators for public safety. That is not what they were for. A samurai's obligation was to his lord, his domain, his military function. When a bear killed a farmer's child in a mountain village in Nara Prefecture, the nearest samurai lord was not sending warriors into the hills. The farmers handled it, or they didn't, and they moved. The second assumption is that dangerous animals were rare and localized. In reality, the predator geography of ancient Japan was dense, varied, and inescapable. Japanese black bears, Ursus Thibetanus japonicus, ranged across the mountain forests of Honshu and Shikoku in numbers that would be difficult to comprehend today. Japanese wolves, now extinct, were widespread across all 3 major islands. Wild boar, which do not read as predators on a modern list but can disembowel a man in seconds, roamed agricultural lowlands alongside the people who farmed them. And then there were the things that operated at night. Most people assume ancient Japanese farmers were primarily threatened by the large invisible. In truth, the deadliest recurring threat to a rural family was not the animal that killed you outright. It was the animal that killed your food supply. The deer that raided the rice paddy, the boar that destroyed a winter's worth of stored grain, the monkeys that stripped a fruit orchard in an afternoon. Starvation killed more people than claws. The real answer to how ancient Japanese people survived is not a story about bravery or weapons. It is a story about architecture, psychology, religion, and a set of practical systems so effective that most people lived their entire lives without ever facing a predator directly. The real answer is stranger and considerably more interesting than anything involving a sword. Roughly 70% of Japan's landmass is mountainous forest, steep, densely wooded, largely uninhabitable for settled farming. The agricultural population was crammed into the remaining 30%, river valleys, coastal plains, the narrow corridors between mountain ranges. This meant that the boundary between human settlement and wild animal territory was not a gradual gradient. It was a hard edge. You could walk from a rice paddy to old-growth forest that had never been cleared in 20 minutes. That edge was where most encounters happened. The Jomon people, who inhabited Japan for roughly 14,000 years before the Yayoi agricultural transition around 300 BCE, were hunter-gatherers who moved through animal territory as participants rather than landlords. They knew the landscape the way a modern person knows their own neighborhood, which paths the bears used, which river bends the salmon ran, which hilltops the wolves denned on in winter. That knowledge did not disappear when rice farming arrived. It became infrastructure. By the Nara period, 710 to 794 CE, the Japanese state was actively trying to expand agricultural land into the foothills, which meant pushing the edge of settlement directly into prime bear and wolf habitat. Government land surveys from this period include entries that translate roughly as land unsuitable due to beast activity, which tells you two things. Animal pressure was significant enough to document officially, and the state was aware of it, but often powerless to change it. Buddhism, which arrived from the Korean peninsula in the 6th century and spread rapidly, complicated the human-animal relationship in a specific and important way. The first precept, the prohibition against taking life, created genuine theological tension for a farming population that needed to kill animals to protect crops and livestock. By the 9th century, most farming communities had developed a working spiritual compromise. Killing predators in defense of life was acceptable, but required ritual acknowledgement. You did not simply kill a bear, you thanked it. You performed a small ceremony. You acknowledged the disruption to the natural order and promised to restore it. This was not purely sentiment, it was social technology. A community that ritualized the killing of animals was a community that regulated it, that didn't kill indiscriminately, that maintained a working relationship with the landscape rather than declaring war on it. The villages that survived long-term were not the ones that killed every bear they encountered. They were the ones that killed the right bears at the right times and left the rest alone. Before we go further, if you're finding this as strange as I did, drop a comment below. What's the most surprising thing ancient people did to coexist with dangerous animals? I read every single one. The first line of defense against predators in ancient Japan was not a weapon, it was a building. Rural farmhouses of the Nara and Heian periods were not the picturesque, low wooden structures you see in period dramas. Working farmhouses in bear country were designed around a single practical priority: keeping animals out at night. Livestock, primarily horses and cattle, both of which represented enormous economic value, were often kept in an attached lower section of the main building, directly beneath the sleeping area. This arrangement meant that a bear or wolf attempting to take a horse in the night was attempting to enter the same structure where several adults were sleeping. The noise alone was usually enough deterrent. The exterior of a working farmhouse compound was typically surrounded by a brushwood fence or, in higher risk areas, a bamboo palisade. Fires burned at the perimeter on cold nights, not for warmth, but for the smell. Bears avoid fire with a consistency that ancient Japanese farmers understood empirically long before anyone could explain why. Villages that experienced repeated animal incursions developed a communal alarm system. A wooden percussion instrument called a hyoshigi, two hardwood blocks struck together, that could be heard across a settlement and meant one thing. Everyone who heard it came out. The Wolf Compact. Here is the part that surprises most people. Japanese wolves were not simply tolerated in ancient Japan. In many regions, they were actively cultivated as protectors. Deer and wild boar were the primary destroyers of agricultural crops. Japanese wolves were the primary predators of deer and boar. A farming community that kept wolves in the surrounding hills did not have a wolf problem. It had a deer control system. Shrines dedicated to wolf veneration. Okami shrines, from the Japanese word for wolf, which is a homophone of the word for great god, existed throughout the mountain regions of Honshu. Farmers left offerings. They requested the wolves' protection of their fields. The Mitsumine shrine in Saitama Prefecture, which still exists today, was issuing wolf amulets to farmers as recently as the 18th century. Small rectangular paper talismans printed with the image of a wolf in black ink. Folded once and slipped inside a narrow wooden holder no longer than a finger. A farmer would walk the perimeter of his rice field at the start of the growing season and press one into the soil at each corner post. The wolf face turned outward toward the tree line. The act took less than 5 minutes. What it communicated to the deer that came to the field edge at dusk was, apparently, enough. This was not superstition operating in the absence of evidence. It worked. A rice paddy at the edge of wolf territory experienced demonstrably less deer predation than one further from it. The amulets were a communication system, a way of marking the field as within the zone of wolf attention, real or implied. The bear problem bears were different. Bears could not be cultivated as allies. Japanese black bears are not typically aggressive toward humans unprovoked. The dangerous encounters in historical records almost always involve one of 3 specific scenarios: a mother with cubs, a bear that has been surprised at close range, or, most commonly, a bear that has learned to associate human settlement with food. That third category was the one that ended lives. A bear that had raided a granary successfully was a bear that would return. The ancient Japanese response to this was swift and absolute in a way that the general wolf tolerance was not. A bear that had entered a human food store was killed, always, without the hesitation applied to bears that simply lived in the surrounding hills. The principle was not cruelty, it was categorical. The moment an animal crossed the threshold from the wild side of the compact to the human side, the compact ended. The killing itself was conducted by a specialist class, hunters called matagi, who operated in the mountain regions of Tohoku and Niigata from at least the Heian period. The matagi were not ordinary farmers who hunted occasionally. They were a distinct professional and social group with their own dialect, their own religious practices, their own code of conduct around the taking of animal life. They maintained detailed oral knowledge of individual bears in their territory, which bears were docile, which were dangerous, where specific animals denned, what their seasonal movement patterns were. When a bear needed to be killed, the community called the matagi. This division of labor was itself a survival technology. It concentrated predator management knowledge in a small group who could maintain it generationally rather than diffusing it across a general population who might forget it between incidents. What the records actually show. The darkest and most instructive detail in the historical record is not a dramatic bear attack or a wolf ambush. It appears in agricultural tax documents from the Heian period, a category of crop loss recorded as kedamono no gai, harm from beasts. These records are methodical, bureaucratic, and reveal something that no heroic narrative would ever tell you. In some mountain-adjacent villages, beast damage to crops was so consistent and so heavy that it was simply factored into the annual tax calculation as an expected loss. Officials did not treat it as an emergency, they treated it as weather. A baseline of destruction that farming communities absorbed, planned around, and survived through sheer surplus production. growing more than they needed specifically because they expected a portion to be taken. This is not a story of humans conquering the wild. It is a story of humans building a life inside a negotiation they could never fully win. The wolves kept the deer down. The matagi kept the dangerous bears down. The architecture kept the livestock alive. The shrines kept the community psychologically coherent in the face of forces they could not control. And the tax records simply accounted for what got through anyway. There is a version of this story that ends with technology, with rifles and land clearance and government extermination campaigns in the Meiji era that drove the Japanese wolf to extinction by 1905 and reduced the bear population to a fraction of its historical range. That story happened. It is real and it is recent. But the thing worth sitting with is not the ending. It is the middle, the 14 centuries between the first rice paddies and the Meiji guns, during which millions of ordinary people lived in genuine proximity to dangerous animals, and mostly managed it without catastrophe. They did it through a combination of things that modern societies have largely separated: practical knowledge, spiritual practice, social organization, and an unsentimental acceptance of loss. The matagi knew which bear was which. The shrines kept the wolves in the hills. The architecture kept the horses alive. The tax records absorbed the damage that got through anyway. The survival framework was not primarily about courage. It was about category management, knowing exactly which animals were allies, which were acceptable neighbors, and which had crossed the line that ended the negotiation. Most of the system ran quietly in the background, and most people never had to use the sharp end of it. What collapsed that system was not any failure of the system itself. It was success. Economic development, expanding agriculture, and the Meiji government's modernization program all pushed human settlement deeper into animal territory than the old compact could accommodate. The wolves were extinct within a generation of that pressure beginning. Today, Japanese black bears are resurging in depopulated mountain areas, moving back into villages that humans have abandoned. The encounters are more dangerous now than they were in the 9th century, not because the bears have changed, but because the humans have. The knowledge is gone. The matagi tradition survives in a handful of communities in Tohoku, mostly as cultural heritage rather than active practice. The shrines still stand. The amulets are still issued at Mitsumine. But the negotiation, the long, careful one that lasted 14 centuries, that one ended, and nobody in the modern encounters has a good working replacement for it. Here's the question that came out of this for me. If the Japanese wolf was not just tolerated but actively cultivated, if farming communities maintained wolf populations in the surrounding hills as a pest control system, left offerings, hung amulets, named shrines, then what exactly happened in the months after the last wolf died in 1905? Did the deer and boar populations explode immediately? Did the crop damage records from that period show a sudden spike? Did the farmers who had relied on wolf presence notice the absence within a single harvest season? Because if they did, if the system was that functional and the collapse was that visible and that fast, then that tells you something specific and uncomfortable about what we lose when we break a compact we built over centuries without quite understanding everything it was doing for us. That question has an answer, and it is considerably darker than you probably expect.